The courtroom was cold that morning, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes your hands shake even when you are trying to look calm. I sat at the table on the left side, my lawyer beside me, a thin folder in front of him that I had not been allowed to open yet. Across the aisle, Daniel sat with his arms crossed and a smile on his face that I had once loved and now could barely stand to look at. He leaned over to his lawyer and whispered something, and they both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that was meant to be seen, not just heard. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my eyes forward because I had promised myself I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me break. 14 years of marriage had taught me that Daniel fed on other people's pain the way some men feed on approval. When the bailiff called the case number, the room went quiet, and the judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked up from her papers. Daniel stood first, straightening his jacket, and said something to his lawyer that made them both glance at me with barely hidden amusement. I clenched my hands under the table so no one would see them trembling. "Your Honor, my client built this life," Daniel's lawyer began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "and my client's wife contributed very little beyond staying home." I almost laughed out loud at that because staying home had meant raising 2 children alone while Daniel disappeared for weeks at a time on business trips. But I said nothing because my lawyer had told me again and again to let him speak first. Daniel turned slightly in his chair so he could look at me, and he mouthed 2 words that I will never forget as long as I live. "Good luck," he said, and then he smiled, the same smile he used to give me at dinner parties when he wanted people to think we were happy. I looked away, toward the window, where the gray morning light was falling across the empty rows of the courtroom benches. I thought about how we got here, how 14 years could collapse into a single cold room with folders and objections and a man who used to hold my hand. I met Daniel when I was 24, working 2 jobs to pay for community college, and he was the kind of charming that made you forget to ask questions. He told me he wanted a partner, someone who would build something with him, and I believed every word because I wanted to believe it. We got married in a small church with folding chairs, and his mother cried through the whole ceremony, though I later learned they were not tears of joy. Back then I did not understand the weight behind her tight smiles, the way she watched me like I was a stranger who had wandered into her family's history. It took years before I understood that she never thought I was good enough for her son, and Daniel never once defended me against that. In our first year of marriage, Daniel started a small contracting business, and I put every dollar I had saved into helping him get it off the ground. I worked as a receptionist during the day and did his bookkeeping at night, staying up until midnight balancing invoices while he watched television in the other room. He used to tell people at parties that he built the business from nothing, and I would smile and nod, because correcting him never seemed worth the fight. By our 5th year, the business was doing well, and Daniel started spending more time at the office and less time at home, which I told myself was normal. We had our first son that year, and I remember how proud I felt watching Daniel hold him, thinking that maybe this would finally soften something in him. For a while it did, or at least it seemed to, and those were some of the only years I look back on without a knot forming in my stomach. Our daughter came 2 years later, and by then Daniel's mother had moved closer to us, insisting she wanted to help with the children. What she really wanted was control, deciding how the kids should be raised, criticizing how I dressed them, how I fed them, how I disciplined them. Daniel never once stepped in, and when I tried to talk to him about it, he would sigh and say I was overreacting, that she meant well. By the time our son turned 7, Daniel had started staying late at the office more often, and there were nights he did not come home until after midnight. I told myself it was the business, that contracting work sometimes ran long, that he was simply exhausted from trying to provide for our family. But there is a difference between exhaustion and distance, and somewhere in those years, Daniel became a stranger who happened to share my bed. I found out about Melissa on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 years before that courtroom morning, when I was looking for a printer cable in his home office drawer. Instead, I found a receipt for a hotel room 40 minutes away, dated the week before, when Daniel had told me he was staying overnight for a job site inspection. I sat on the floor of that office for almost an hour, holding that piece of paper, feeling something inside me quietly and permanently break. When I confronted him that night, he did not deny it the way I expected him to. He simply looked tired, almost annoyed, like I had interrupted something important. "It's not what you think," he said, which is what people always say right before confirming that it is exactly what you think. Melissa, it turned out, was a subcontractor he had been working with for over a year, and their relationship had apparently started sometime after our daughter was born. I should have left then, and some nights I still ask myself why I didn't, but I had 2 children, no savings of my own, and a mother-in-law who would have destroyed me in the divorce. Daniel promised it was over, that it had been a mistake, that he loved his family more than anything, and I wanted so badly to believe him that I let myself. For almost a year afterward, things seemed to improve, or maybe I simply stopped looking too closely at the parts of his life he kept hidden from me. It was our son's 9th birthday party when everything finally came apart in front of everyone. In the backyard, surrounded by balloons and the smell of grilled food. Daniel's mother had insisted on planning half the party, and she had invited people I did not know, including a woman who kept glancing at Daniel with familiar eyes. I did not need anyone to tell me who she was, because the moment I saw the way Daniel's hand brushed against her lower back, I already knew. I pulled him aside near the garage, away from the children, and asked him directly if that was Melissa standing in my backyard, eating cake at my son's birthday. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He simply said, "She's a friend of the family now, don't make this weird in front of everyone." Something in me went numb in that moment, the kind of numb that comes right before a person finally, quietly, decides they are done. I did not make a scene that day because I refused to give his mother the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of her carefully chosen guests. Instead, I smiled, I cut the cake, I sang happy birthday to my son, and later that night, after the guests left, I told Daniel I wanted a divorce. He laughed at first, actually laughed, and said, "You won't survive without me, you don't even have your name on anything." The weeks that followed that birthday party were some of the strangest of my entire marriage, because Daniel did not treat my request for divorce as something serious at all. He continued going to work each morning as though nothing had changed, coming home in the evening expecting dinner on the table, expecting me to fold laundry, expecting life to simply continue as it always had. When I brought up the subject again, calmly, at the kitchen table one night, he waved his hand dismissively and said, "You'll calm down, you always do." That dismissal, more than almost anything else in our marriage, was the moment I began to understand how completely Daniel had underestimated me, not out of malice exactly, but out of a lifetime of never being told no. His mother had raised him to believe that women in his life existed to accommodate him, first as his mother, then as his girlfriends, and finally as his wife, and I had spent 14 years unknowingly reinforcing that belief. I began quietly to research divorce lawyers in our area, careful to clear my search history each time, terrified that Daniel would somehow find out before I was ready to act. It took nearly 2 months before I worked up the courage to schedule my first consultation with Rebecca, sitting in her small office downtown, nervously explaining a marriage that sounded, even to my own ears, almost unbelievable when spoken aloud. Rebecca listened without judgment, taking notes in careful handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific dates, specific documents, specific patterns of behavior she said would matter later. "Most people come to me after the crisis," she told me that first day. "You're coming to me while you're still gathering strength, and that's actually the best position to be in." She asked me during that first meeting whether I had access to any financial records, any documentation of how our assets had been structured over the years, and I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the old lockbox in my closet. "Bring everything," she said, "even things that seem unimportant. Sometimes the smallest details end up mattering the most in cases like yours." I remember driving home that afternoon feeling, for the first time in months, like I was finally doing something instead of simply enduring something. Over the following weeks, I began quietly organizing every document I could find, old bank statements tucked into filing cabinets, printed emails I had saved years earlier without fully understanding why, photographs with timestamps that told their own quiet story. Daniel, oblivious to what was happening beneath the surface of our shared home, continued his routine of long office hours and weekend business trips that I now understood with painful clarity were rarely about business at all. I began keeping a private journal during this period as well, writing down dates, conversations, small details I worried I might otherwise forget under the pressure of everything that was coming. It was during this quiet preparation phase that Daniel's behavior at home grew noticeably colder, as though some instinct told him that something had shifted, even if he could not identify exactly what. He began making comments about my spending, questioning small purchases he had never cared about before, subtly testing whether I still felt as financially dependent on him as I once had. I played along, careful not to reveal how much I had already begun to understand about the accounts, the transfers, the years of careful financial architecture designed to keep me powerless. One evening, about 3 months before I formally filed, Daniel came home unusually late, smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine, and when I asked where he had been, he simply said, "Work, obviously." I did not argue, did not accuse, did not give him any reason to suspect that I was no longer the same woman who used to cry quietly in the bathroom after finding evidence of his affairs. Instead, I noted the date in my journal, cross-referencing it later with credit card statements Rebecca had shown me how to properly request and organize for legal purposes. My daughter, only 6 at the time, began having trouble sleeping during those months, waking up with nightmares she could not quite explain, clinging to me at bedtime in a way that broke my heart every single night. I wondered, painfully, how much children absorb from the tension in a household even when adults believe they are successfully hiding their conflicts behind closed doors and lowered voices. I promised myself, during those long nights rocking her back to sleep, that whatever came next, I would fight to give both my children a home built on honesty instead of quiet, corrosive fear. Rebecca filed the initial divorce paperwork on a Tuesday morning in early spring, and I remember sitting in my car afterward, engine running, hands trembling, feeling a mixture of terror and relief so intense it left me physically shaking. Daniel was served that same afternoon at his office, and he called me almost immediately, his voice tight with a fury I had rarely heard from him before, demanding to know what exactly I thought I was doing. "You have no idea what you just started," he said, and I remember feeling, despite the fear in my chest, a strange sense of calm settle over me, because for the first time in years I had finally stopped waiting for his permission. The initial months of the legal process moved slowly, filled with temporary hearings about living arrangements, temporary custody schedules, and increasingly hostile communication between our respective lawyers. Daniel moved out reluctantly, insisting the house should remain his despite both our names being on the deed, a claim Rebecca quickly and easily dismantled using basic property law. Diane began inserting herself into every conversation possible, calling me directly despite Rebecca's explicit instructions that all communication should go through legal counsel, trying to negotiate on her son's behalf as though she were somehow an official party to the case. During one particularly tense phone call, Diane told me in a voice dripping with false sympathy that she hoped I knew what I was doing, reminding me that Daniel had resources I could not possibly compete with. I did not respond to her threats directly, having learned by then that engaging with Diane rarely led anywhere productive, and instead simply forwarded the entire phone transcript to Rebecca that same evening. Rebecca later used that documented pattern of Diane's interference as additional evidence supporting our argument that the family's financial maneuvering had been a coordinated, ongoing effort rather than an isolated incident. That sentence stayed with me for months, because it was true in ways that frightened me. The house, the business, even our joint accounts were structured entirely around him. Daniel had insisted years earlier that it was simpler for tax purposes to keep the business and most of our assets solely in his name, and I had trusted him completely. I did not realize until much later how deliberate that structure had been, how carefully he had built a version of our life where I owned almost nothing. But there was one thing Daniel did not know I still had, something I had kept quietly for years without ever telling him, tucked away in a small metal lockbox. It was a folder of documents I had gathered slowly, almost without meaning to, starting the year I found that hotel receipt in his desk drawer. Bank statements, printed emails, photographs, a voice memo I never intended to use, evidence I had collected not out of vengeance but out of quiet self-protection. I am not a vindictive person, and for years I told myself I was keeping those documents just in case, never truly believing I would need them. But something in me, some instinct built by years of watching Daniel lie so easily, told me to keep records, to write things down, to save what I could. When I finally filed for divorce, my lawyer, a common thorough woman named Rebecca, asked me one simple question that changed everything that followed. "Do you have anything that shows how the business assets were actually funded?" she asked, and I remembered the lockbox sitting quietly in the back of my closet. Inside it, I found something I had almost forgotten I still had, an old joint account statement from the very first year of Daniel's contracting business. It showed in black and white that the initial funding for his company had come from a personal loan I had co-signed, using my name and my credit. Rebecca's eyes lit up when she saw it, because under the law in our state, that meant a significant portion of the business, despite being in his name alone, could still be considered marital property. Daniel had spent years telling everyone, including his own mother, that he built the company entirely from nothing, entirely on his own effort and his own money. That single piece of paper quietly proved otherwise, and it became the foundation of everything Rebecca began building for my case over the following months. But paperwork alone would not be enough, because Daniel's lawyer was aggressive, and Daniel himself seemed convinced that his mother's money and his own charm could smooth over any inconsistency. His mother, Diane, had never liked me, and throughout the divorce proceedings she made it clear, through comments to mutual friends, that she considered me an opportunist who had trapped her son. What Diane did not know was that her own words, spoken carelessly at a dinner months earlier, would eventually become part of the very evidence used against her son. It happened at a family dinner I had reluctantly attended for the sake of the children, back when Daniel and I were still pretending things might work out. Diane had too much wine that evening, and in a moment of loose-tongued honesty, she told a story about how she had helped Daniel move money before we got married. She laughed about it, thinking it made her clever, describing how they had structured certain accounts specifically so that in case of a divorce, I would never be entitled to anything. I remember sitting there, smiling politely, while my stomach turned into ice because I finally understood that this had never been an accident, it had been a plan. I excused myself to the bathroom that night and wrote down everything Diane had said word for word while it was still fresh in my memory and saved it in my phone. I did not know then that this single memory recorded quietly in a notes app would become one of the most important pieces of my entire case. Rebecca, when I told her about it months later, asked if I remembered the exact date of that dinner because if certain financial transfers had happened around that time, it would confirm intent. We pulled old text messages, calendar entries, even a group photo posted online from that dinner, piecing together a timeline that lined up with unusual account activity from years earlier. It turned out that 3 months before our wedding, Daniel had quietly moved a significant portion of his personal savings into an account under his mother's name. That account, as we later discovered through subpoenaed bank records, had been used to fund the initial equipment and vehicles for his contracting business before it ever opened. In other words, before we were even married, Daniel and his mother had structured his finances specifically to protect assets from a marriage they clearly never intended to treat as equal. Rebecca called it one of the clearest examples of premarital asset shielding she had seen in years, and she said it changed the entire direction of my case. Meanwhile, at home, things were becoming harder for me in ways that had nothing to do with paperwork, because Daniel had grown colder, more dismissive, almost cruel in small daily moments. He would make comments in front of our children about how I would end up with nothing, laughing it off as a joke whenever I asked him to stop. Our son, only 9 at the time, began asking me quiet questions at bedtime, like whether we would have to move away, whether Daddy was going to take everything. I promised him we would be okay, even though some nights I lay awake terrified that Daniel's confidence was not just arrogance, but something closer to certainty. Diane began showing up more frequently during my custody time, uninvited, claiming she was simply picking up the children for ice cream or a visit to the park. It took me weeks to realize she was documenting things too, taking photos of my apartment, my car, anything she thought might make me look unstable or unfit as a mother. One afternoon, she arrived early to pick up the kids and let herself into my apartment using a spare key Daniel had apparently kept without ever telling me. I found her standing in my kitchen opening cabinets, and when I asked what she was doing, she said simply, "Just checking on the children's well-being, dear." I asked her to leave immediately, and she did, but not before taking a photo of my sink, which had a few dishes stacked from that morning's breakfast rush. That photo, we later learned, was submitted by Daniel's lawyer as supposed evidence of parental neglect, an image of a few unwashed dishes stretched into a narrative of chaos. Rebecca was furious when she saw it, not because it worried her, but because it revealed exactly how far Daniel and his family were willing to go to win. "This tells me they're scared," she said calmly. "People don't manufacture small lies like this unless they're worried about what the truth actually looks like." As the court dates approached, Daniel's confidence seemed to grow louder, almost performative, as if he needed everyone around him to believe the outcome was already decided. He started introducing Melissa to mutual friends as though she had always been part of his life, conveniently rewriting the timeline of their relationship to seem less damaging. At pickups and drop-offs, he would make pointed comments telling me things like, "You should really start looking for a smaller place," as if my future had already been settled. I remember one evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time in months, not from sadness but exhaustion. Rebecca had warned me that the emotional toll of a contested divorce, especially one involving a manipulative partner, often hits hardest right before the final hearing. She was right, because as the court date grew closer, I felt like I was drowning in the weight of everything I had carried quietly for years. But something shifted the week before the hearing, when Rebecca called me with news that made my hands shake as I held the phone to my ear. "We found something," she said, her voice steady but unmistakably excited. "Something Daniel's own mother wrote that could change everything." It turned out that during discovery, Daniel's legal team had been required to hand over years of email correspondence tied to the business accounts in question. Buried in an old email thread from years earlier, one that Daniel's lawyers had apparently overlooked in their haste to compile the discovery documents, was a letter written by Diane herself. It was addressed to an old family friend, a woman who had since passed away, and it detailed, in Diane's own words, the plan to protect Daniel's assets before the wedding. The email described specific account transfers, the timing of those transfers relative to our engagement, and even mentioned, chillingly, making sure she never sees a dime if this doesn't work out. Rebecca explained that under normal circumstances, an old personal email might never surface in court, but because Diane had used a company email address linked to Daniel's business, it became part of the official record. "This isn't just financial evidence anymore," Rebecca told me. "This shows deliberate intent to defraud a spouse of marital rights before the marriage even happened." For the first time in months, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest, a small, quiet ember of hope that had not been there before. The night before the final hearing, I could not sleep, replaying every humiliation, every dismissive comment, every moment Daniel had made me feel small over 14 years. I thought about the birthday party, about Melissa's hand brushing his back, about the way he had laughed when I first mentioned divorce, so certain I would fold. I promised myself that no matter what happened in that courtroom, I would walk in with my head high because I had done nothing wrong, and it was time everyone knew it. Now, sitting in that same courtroom, watching Daniel whisper jokes to his lawyer while the judge reviewed our file, I felt strangely calm, almost detached from the tension around me. Rebecca leaned over and whispered, "Remember, we let them talk first, we let them get comfortable, and then we show the judge exactly what kind of people we're dealing with." I nodded, gripping the edge of the table, watching Daniel's lawyer stand again to continue outlining in confident tones why Daniel deserved to retain full ownership of the business. "My client single-handedly built this company from the ground up," the lawyer repeated, "with no financial assistance from his spouse, who contributed only domestic support during the marriage." I glanced at Rebecca, who remained perfectly still, patient, waiting for her moment the way a hunter waits without ever revealing impatience. Daniel, emboldened by his lawyer's confidence, turned toward me again with that same infuriating smile, mouthing the words, "Told you," as if the outcome was already decided. When his lawyer finally finished speaking, the judge looked toward our table and asked if we had a response, and Rebecca rose slowly, calmly, with the folder in her hand. "Your Honor," she began, "with respect to opposing counsel's claim that my client contributed nothing financially, I would like to enter into evidence a personal loan document from the year the business was founded." She placed the loan statement on the table in front of the judge, the one showing my name as co-signer on the very first funding used to launch Daniel's company. The judge studied it silently for a moment, her expression unreadable, while Daniel's lawyer leaned over to whisper something to him that no longer looked quite as confident. "This is the first of several documents," Rebecca continued, "that demonstrate a pattern of deliberate asset restructuring designed specifically to exclude my client from marital property." She then submitted the bank records showing the transfer into Diane's account months before the wedding, followed by the equipment purchases traced back to that same account. Daniel's smile had disappeared entirely now, replaced by a tightness around his jaw that I recognized from years of watching him try to control a situation slipping away. His lawyer objected, arguing that the timing of these transfers was circumstantial, that there was no proof of intent, only unfortunate coincidence in how the finances happened to align. That was when Rebecca said the words I had been waiting months to hear her say out loud, in front of everyone in that cold, quiet courtroom. "Your Honor, we do have proof of intent," she said, in the form of a written communication from the respondent's mother describing the plan in her own words. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Rebecca handed the printed email to the bailiff, who carried it forward and placed it directly in front of the judge. Daniel turned to look at his mother, seated in the row behind him, and for the first time that day I saw real fear cross his face. Judge read silently for a long moment, her eyes moving carefully across the page, and then she looked up, first at Daniel, then at Diane, then finally at me. "I'd like to read a portion of this into the record," she said, her voice steady and deliberate, and the entire courtroom fell into silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and began to read Diane's own words aloud, the ones that had once been buried quietly in an old, forgotten email thread. "We need to move the funds before the wedding," the judge read, her voice flat and clinical, stripping away every ounce of casual cruelty Diane had once hidden behind wine and laughter. "If things don't work out, she should walk away with nothing, since none of this was ever really hers to begin with," the judge continued, each word landing like a small, sharp stone. I watched Diane's face drain of color as the courtroom absorbed those words, watched Daniel stare down at the table in front of him, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The judge set the paper down and looked directly at Daniel's lawyer, her expression no longer neutral, but sharpened by something close to quiet disapproval. "Counsel," she said, "this court takes a very dim view of deliberate premarital asset concealment, particularly when there is documented evidence of clear intent to defraud." Daniel's lawyer opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to understand, perhaps for the first time, how significantly the ground beneath their case had shifted. Rebecca was not finished, and she calmly requested permission to submit one final piece of evidence, the recorded memory I had written down the night of that family dinner years earlier. Though it was not admissible as a formal recording, the corroborating bank transfer dates aligned so precisely with what I had documented that the judge allowed it as supporting testimony. It painted a complete picture now, not of circumstantial misfortune, but of a calculated years-long effort to ensure I would leave this marriage with absolutely nothing. The judge called for a brief recess, and during that time the courtroom buzzed with quiet, tense whispers, Daniel's family clustering together, refusing to look in our direction. When we reconvened, the judge addressed the room with the calm authority of someone who had made her decision and intended to explain it clearly without room for argument. Marital property law exists to prevent exactly this kind of behavior, she said, the deliberate structuring of assets to exploit a spouse who trusted her partner completely. She ruled that, given the clear evidence of premeditated asset concealment, the business would be considered marital property in its entirety, subject to equitable division under the law. Daniel's face went pale as the judge continued, awarding me not only a substantial share of the business value, but also spousal support reflecting the years I had contributed unpaid labor to its success. Diane sat frozen in the row behind him, and for the first time in 14 years I watched someone who had spent so long looking down on me finally look away in shame. But the judge was not finished, and she turned her attention to something else entirely, something Rebecca and I had not even fully anticipated walking into that courtroom. "I am also troubled," she said, "by evidence submitted regarding a photograph taken inside the mother's home without consent, used in an apparent attempt to influence custody proceedings." She looked directly at Diane's lawyer this time, her voice hardening slightly, and reminded the room that fabricated or manipulated evidence in custody matters would not be tolerated in her courtroom. Daniel's lawyer tried to explain the photograph as a simple misunderstanding, but the judge cut him off, stating plainly that any further attempts at such tactics would be reported to the Bar Association. I felt something unclench in my chest as I listened. Something that had been tight and afraid for years finally allowed for the first time to loosen just slightly. Daniel did not look at me as the judge delivered her final ruling, and for a man who had spent our entire marriage certain he would always come out on top, his silence said everything. The judge continued speaking for several more minutes, outlining the specific percentages of the business valuation to be awarded, the timeline for the transfer of funds, and the schedule of spousal support payments moving forward. I listened to every word carefully, aware that Rebecca had warned me the numbers themselves would take time to fully register, that the emotional weight of vindication often arrives before the practical details ever fully sink in. Daniel's lawyer requested a brief sidebar to discuss the custody portion of the ruling, and the judge agreed, though her tone made clear that her patience for further delay tactics had grown noticeably thin. When court resumed, the judge addressed the custody evaluation directly, referencing Ms. Alvarez's report by name, noting the clear disparity between the two households in terms of consistent engagement with the children's daily needs. She awarded me primary physical custody, with a structured visitation schedule for Daniel that included specific provisions preventing Diane from being present during handoffs without prior written agreement between both parties. I felt tears finally break free as she read that provision aloud, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing my children would be protected from the very manipulation I had spent years quietly enduring myself. Daniel's lawyer attempted one final objection, arguing that the custody restrictions regarding Diane were overly broad and unfairly punitive toward a grandmother who simply wanted to be involved in her grandchildren's lives. The judge looked at him directly, her expression unreadable, and said simply, "Given the evidence presented today regarding this family's history of manipulation and concealment, I believe these provisions are entirely reasonable and necessary." Diane's face, still pale from hearing her own words read aloud earlier, tightened further at that statement, though she said nothing, staring down at her hands folded tightly in her lap. As the judge gathered her papers and prepared to formally close the proceedings, she paused for a moment and looked directly at me, her expression softening slightly from the sharp authority she had maintained throughout the hearing. "I want to commend you," she said, "for the thoroughness and integrity of the documentation presented today. It is rare to see a case built on such careful, honest record-keeping rather than speculation or exaggeration." I nodded, unable to fully find my voice in that moment, overwhelmed by hearing a stranger in a position of such authority acknowledge, out loud, the years of quiet effort that had led to this single afternoon. The gavel sounded, and just like that, 14 years of marriage, 3 years of quiet evidence gathering, and 8 months of formal legal battle came to a close in the span of a single sentence. Daniel remained seated for a long moment after the judge left the bench, staring at the table in front of him while his lawyer quietly gathered papers and avoided making eye contact with anyone in the room. Diane stood first, adjusting her coat with trembling hands, and walked quickly toward the exit without looking back, moving faster than I had ever seen her move in the 14 years I had known her. Rebecca turned to me, a small, genuine smile breaking through her professional composure for the first time all day, and said quietly, "That's it, it's over, you did it." I felt my legs go weak with relief, gripping the edge of the table for support, while behind me I heard my mother let out a small, quiet sob of relief she had been holding back throughout the entire hearing. Daniel finally stood, gathering his things slowly, and for one brief moment our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw, for the first time in years, something that almost resembled genuine humility. He did not speak, and neither did I, because there was nothing left to say that thousands of dollars in legal fees, months of depositions, and one devastating letter had not already said far more clearly than either of us ever could. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt sharper and cleaner than it had in months, and Rebecca squeezed my shoulder as we walked down the marble steps together. "You did that," she said, "not the documents, not me, you, by keeping records, by trusting your instincts even when everyone around you told you not to worry." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, watching Daniel and Diane climb into their car without a single glance back in my direction. That evening, I picked up my children from school, and my son asked me quietly in the back seat whether everything was going to be okay now. I told him yes, and for the first time in a long time I actually believed it myself, not because the pain was gone but because the truth had finally been seen. We stopped for ice cream on the way home, something we had not done in months, and I watched my children laugh in a way that felt lighter than it had in years. In the months that followed, Daniel tried briefly to appeal the ruling, but the evidence was too clear, too well documented, and his lawyer eventually advised him to accept the settlement. Diane stopped attending family events for a while, embarrassed by the way her own words had unraveled a plan she had spent years quietly protecting. Melissa, as I later heard through mutual acquaintances, ended things with Daniel not long after the divorce was finalized, unwilling to be tied to someone whose reputation had been so publicly damaged. I used part of the settlement to open a small bookkeeping business of my own, something I had quietly dreamed about for years while managing Daniel's finances in the shadows. It felt strange at first, signing my own name to something that belonged entirely to me, but slowly that strangeness turned into something closer to pride. My children adjusted better than I expected, and over time, the fear in my son's voice at bedtime faded into ordinary conversations about school and friends and weekend plans. Sometimes I think back to that morning in the courtroom, to Daniel's smile before the hearing began, so certain that confidence alone could rewrite 14 years of quiet deception. I think about the letter his own mother wrote, never imagining it would one day be read aloud in a room full of strangers, unraveling everything she had tried to protect. And I think about the version of myself who sat quietly for years, saving documents she hoped she would never need, never once imagining how much they would eventually matter. I do not know if Daniel ever truly understood what he lost that day. Not just the business, not just the money, but the certainty that he could always control how our story ended. For years he had written the narrative of our marriage in his own favor, confident that no one would ever challenge the version of events he presented so convincingly. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, spoke louder than any smile, any whispered joke, any confident glance across a courtroom aisle. There were things that happened in the months leading up to that final hearing that I have not yet told, moments that tested me in ways I never expected to survive. About 4 months before the trial date, Daniel filed a motion for temporary primary custody, claiming that my new work schedule made me an unreliable presence for the children. I remember reading the filing at my kitchen table, my hands shaking so badly that I had to set the papers down twice before I could finish reading them. Rebecca warned me that this was a common tactic, filing aggressive custody motions not necessarily to win them, but to frighten the other party into accepting a worse financial settlement. "He's trying to make you desperate," she told me over the phone. "Desperate people sign bad deals just to make the fighting stop. Don't give him that." I held on to her words like a rope in those weeks, repeating them to myself every time fear tried to convince me to simply give up and let Daniel have his way. The custody evaluator assigned to our case was a quiet, methodical woman named Ms. Alvarez, who scheduled separate interviews with both Daniel and me, along with home visits to each of our residences. When she came to my apartment, she noted the children's bedrooms, decorated carefully despite my limited budget, filled with drawings my daughter had made and books my son loved to read before bed. She asked me detailed questions about our daily routines, about school pickups, about how I handled discipline, and I answered honestly without embellishment because I had nothing to hide. When she visited Daniel's house, a much larger home he had moved into after we separated, she reported later that the children's rooms there felt sparse, almost unused, as though they were guest rooms rather than places where children actually lived. She also noted, in her official report, that Daniel seemed unable to answer basic questions about their school schedules, their teachers, or even simple details like our daughter's allergy to peanuts. Diane, who was present during part of that visit, tried to answer several questions on Daniel's behalf, which Ms. Alvarez specifically flagged as a concerning pattern of parental disengagement. Reading that report weeks later felt like watching a slow, quiet vindication unfold on paper, page after page confirming what I had known for years but had never been able to prove to anyone else. Daniel's lawyer tried to argue that the evaluator was biased, that she had spent more time at my home simply because I had been more available for scheduling, but the judge did not seem convinced by that argument. Still, the custody question remained unresolved heading into the final hearing, adding an entirely separate layer of fear to the financial battle I was already fighting. It was during this period that Melissa re-entered the story in a way I had not anticipated, appearing one afternoon outside my daughter's elementary school during pickup time. She approached me in the parking lot, and for a moment I thought she wanted to apologize or perhaps explain herself, but instead she seemed almost nervous, glancing over her shoulder as she spoke. "I don't think you understand what Daniel is planning," she said quietly, "and I don't want to be part of it anymore, not after everything I've learned these past few months." I stood frozen by my car, unsure whether to trust a single word coming out of her mouth, given everything she had already cost my family, everything she represented in the wreckage of my marriage. But she continued, telling me that Daniel had mentioned more than once that he intended to drag out the custody battle specifically to drain my legal funds, forcing me to settle out of sheer financial exhaustion. She also mentioned, almost in passing, that Daniel had once joked with her about how his mother had handled everything long before we ever got married, though she claimed not to know the specifics. I called Rebecca the moment I got home, relaying everything Melissa had said, and Rebecca, though cautious about using an ex-mistress as a witness, noted that her account lined up closely with the email evidence we already had. "It doesn't hurt to have her on record," Rebecca said. "Even if a judge doesn't weigh it heavily, it corroborates the pattern of behavior we're already building a case around." Melissa eventually agreed to provide a brief written statement, careful and vague about her own relationship with Daniel, but clear about what she claimed to have overheard regarding his intentions. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of the entire process, filled with depositions, document requests, and increasingly hostile emails from Daniel's legal team demanding clarification on minor financial details. I remember sitting in Rebecca's office late one evening, surrounded by boxes of paperwork, feeling completely overwhelmed by how much of my life had been reduced to spreadsheets and sworn statements. "This is the part nobody shows you in movies," Rebecca said gently, noticing my exhaustion. "The actual work of proving the truth is slow, and it is boring, and it is absolutely necessary." During one deposition, Daniel was asked directly under oath about the source of his initial business funding, and for the first time I watched him struggle to maintain his usual composure. He gave vague, shifting answers, claiming he could not recall the exact details of a loan taken out more than a decade earlier, even though his own signature appeared clearly on the original documents. His lawyer tried repeatedly to redirect the questioning, but the court reporter simply continued typing, capturing every hesitation, every contradiction, every moment Daniel's story failed to hold together. Diane was also deposed during this period, and her testimony, though carefully worded, contained enough inconsistencies with her own earlier email that Rebecca flagged it immediately as a potential perjury concern. When confronted directly about the email discussing moving funds before the wedding, Diane claimed she could not recall writing it, despite the email clearly originating from her verified account. Rebecca did not push the perjury angle too hard at that stage, preferring instead to save the full weight of that contradiction for the final hearing, where its impact would be far greater. Throughout all of this, I continued working, continued picking up my children from school, continued trying to maintain some sense of normal life despite the chaos unfolding around us in conference rooms and legal filings. My daughter, only 7 at the time, began asking why her father seemed so angry whenever he came to pick her up, and I struggled to find honest answers that would not frighten her further. I told her simply that adults sometimes have disagreements that take time to work out, and that no matter what happened, both her father and I loved her very much. There were nights I cried alone in my closet, quietly so the children would not hear me, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of fighting for everything I had built, everything I deserved, everything I had been told for years I was not entitled to. But there were also nights of quiet resolve, moments where I would sit at my kitchen table reviewing documents Rebecca had sent over, feeling a strange, steady strength growing inside me that I had not felt in years. I began to realize that this process, as exhausting as it was also teaching me something Daniel had spent our entire marriage trying to prevent me from learning, that I was capable, competent, and entirely able to stand on my own. 2 weeks before the final hearing, Daniel's lawyer sent a settlement offer that Rebecca described as insultingly low, offering me a small lump sum in exchange for dropping all claims to the business and agreeing to reduced custody time. I remember staring at that offer, feeling a flash of the old fear that had kept me quiet for so many years, the fear that maybe this was the best I could hope for, that fighting further would only make things worse. Rebecca looked at me steadily across her desk and said, "You do not have to accept fear dressed up as a deal. We have the evidence and we are going to use it." I rejected the offer that same afternoon, and Daniel's lawyer responded within hours with an email full of thinly veiled threats about the cost and duration of continued litigation, clearly hoping to pressure me into reconsidering. I forwarded that email to Rebecca without comment, and she called me almost immediately, her voice calm but firm, telling me that this kind of pressure tactic was exactly what desperate opposing counsel resorted to when their case was weakening. "They know what we have," she said, "and they are terrified of what happens when a judge finally sees all of it laid out in one place." In the final days before the hearing, I barely slept, running through every possible outcome in my mind, preparing myself emotionally for scenarios where the judge might not rule in my favor despite everything we had gathered. A week before the hearing, something happened that nearly derailed everything we had worked so hard to build, when Melissa suddenly called Rebecca's office asking to withdraw her written statement entirely. Rebecca called me immediately, her voice carefully neutral, though I could hear the concern beneath it, explaining that Melissa claimed she had been contacted directly by Daniel's lawyer with an offer to cover her legal fees on an unrelated matter. It did not take much imagination to understand what that meant, a quiet, thinly veiled attempt to buy her silence before she could do any further damage to Daniel's case. Rebecca explained that we could not force Melissa to testify against her will, but that the timing of her withdrawal so soon after Daniel's lawyer had reportedly reached out was itself worth documenting for the record. "We don't need her statement to win this," Rebecca reassured me. "We have Diane's own words, we have the bank records, we have the timeline. Melissa's account was always supporting evidence, never the foundation." Still, the news left me rattled for days, a fresh reminder of exactly how far Daniel and his family were willing to go to protect the version of events they wanted the court to believe. Around that same time, my son came home from a weekend visit with his father looking unusually quiet, picking at his dinner instead of eating it, avoiding my eyes in a way that immediately worried me. When I gently asked if everything was okay, he hesitated for a long moment before telling me that his father had asked him during the visit whether I had said anything bad about him or Grandma Diane. I felt a cold flash of anger at the thought of my 9-year-old being quietly interrogated by his own father, used as an unwitting source of information in a legal battle he was far too young to understand. I called Rebecca the next morning and she advised me to document the conversation carefully, word for word, and to gently remind my son without placing any blame on his father that he never had to answer questions like that. That evening, I sat with him on his bed and told him softly that whatever happened between his father and me, none of it was his responsibility to manage, and that it was always okay to tell either of us he simply didn't want to talk about certain things. He nodded, visibly relieved, and asked if he could just tell his dad that from now on, and I told him yes, absolutely, that boundary was entirely his to set. Rebecca later submitted this incident, along with the custody evaluator's report, as further evidence supporting concerns about Daniel's judgment regarding age-appropriate boundaries with the children during an active legal dispute. Daniel's lawyer, when confronted with the allegation during a pretrial conference, dismissed it as an innocent parental question, but the judge presiding over preliminary custody matters noted it in her file without comment. I began to realize slowly that every small overreach Daniel and Diane made, every attempt to manipulate the situation in their favor, was quietly, steadily strengthening the very case they were trying to undermine. 3 days before the final hearing, Diane attempted one last maneuver, showing up unannounced at my bookkeeping office, waiting in the small reception area until I finished a client meeting. I remember the strange, cold feeling of seeing her there, dressed impeccably as always, sitting with her hands folded primly in her lap like she had every right to be present in a space that had nothing to do with her. "I only want to talk," she said when I approached her, though her tone carried the same practiced sweetness I had learned over 14 years to recognize as a warning sign rather than genuine kindness. She told me that she hoped we could resolve things like family, that dragging everything through a public courtroom would only hurt the children in the long run, that surely I understood how much was at stake for everyone involved. I told her as calmly as I could manage that I had tried for years to resolve things quietly, and that quiet had only ever benefited her and her son, never me, never the children she claimed to be so worried about. Her expression hardened slightly at that, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the calculation underneath, and she left without another word, though not before glancing meaningfully at my office computer as if trying to gauge what evidence might still be sitting there. I called Rebecca immediately after Diane left, describing the visit in detail, and Rebecca noted it carefully, mentioning that an unsolicited, unannounced visit to my place of business during active litigation could itself be raised as a form of pressure or intimidation if necessary. "They're getting desperate," she said. "People don't show up uninvited at someone's workplace 3 days before a hearing unless they're starting to feel the walls closing in." That night I slept better than I had in weeks, not because the fear had disappeared entirely, but because I finally understood with total clarity that Daniel and Diane were far more afraid of that courtroom than I was. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and quiet, the kind of ordinary morning that gives no indication of the weight it is about to carry, and I remember standing in front of my closet for nearly 10 minutes trying to decide what to wear. I settled on a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that could be twisted into a narrative about frivolous spending or inappropriate presentation, exactly as Rebecca had advised weeks earlier. My mother, who had driven 3 hours to be there for moral support, sat with me at the kitchen table that morning, holding my hand across the table while I tried to eat breakfast I could not actually taste. "You've done everything right," she told me, echoing words Rebecca had said the night before. "No matter what happens today, you fought for yourself, and that matters regardless of any single outcome." I nodded, grateful for her presence, though nothing could fully calm the storm of nerves twisting through my stomach as we drove together toward the courthouse in silence. When we arrived, I saw Daniel's car already parked near the entrance and Diane standing beside it, adjusting her coat, glancing toward the building with an expression of practiced confidence I recognized all too well. Rebecca met us just outside the courtroom doors, her expression calm and focused, running through last-minute reminders in a low, steady voice meant only for me. "Whatever they say in there," she reminded me, "let it happen, let them build their story first. We don't interrupt, we don't react, we simply wait for our moment." I took a deep breath, squeezed my mother's hand one final time, and walked through those heavy wooden doors into the courtroom that would, by the end of that day, finally give voice to everything I had spent years quietly documenting. Rebecca met me one last time the night before the hearing, walking through exactly how she planned to present each piece of evidence, in what order, and how she intended to handle any objections from Daniel's lawyer. "Tomorrow," she said, closing her folder, "we are not just presenting documents, we are presenting the truth, in a room where the truth is finally allowed to matter more than confidence." Now when I look at my children sleeping peacefully at night, in a home that is entirely my own, I no longer feel the fear that once kept me awake for years. I feel something steadier, something earned, the quiet knowledge that even when the people who are supposed to protect you choose to betray you instead, the truth eventually finds its way to daylight. And sometimes that truth arrives exactly when you need it most, read aloud in a cold courtroom, in a voice that finally, after everything, believed me. There is a part of this story I have not shared yet, something that happened almost a year after the hearing, when I thought the hardest parts were finally behind me for good. Daniel, struggling to rebuild his reputation after word of the ruling spread quietly through our small business community, reached out asking to meet, saying he wanted to talk about moving forward. I agreed only because Rebecca advised me it was smarter to hear him out on neutral ground than to leave any unresolved conversation hanging over our co-parenting arrangement. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, a place with too much fluorescent lighting and the smell of burnt espresso, and Daniel looked different than he had during the trial, smaller somehow, less certain. He apologized, or at least attempted to, in the fumbling way people do when they're more sorry about consequences than about the actions that caused them. "I never thought it would go this far," he said, staring at his coffee cup instead of at me. "I thought you'd just accept things the way they were." I told him calmly that accepting things the way they were had nearly cost me everything: my sense of self, my financial security, even my confidence as a mother, and that I was done accepting anything less than the truth. He nodded slowly, and for a brief moment I saw something like genuine regret cross his face, though I have long since stopped trying to guess what Daniel actually feels beneath the surface he shows the world. We talked, stiffly at first, about the children's schedules, about upcoming school events, about the logistics of shared holidays, the practical scaffolding that now held together whatever remained between us. Before we left, he asked one more question, quieter than everything else he had said that afternoon, almost as if he were afraid of the answer. "Did you ever think about just letting it go, not fighting for the business, not digging up all of that?" he asked, and I understood immediately what he was really asking. He wanted to know if some part of me still wished I had simply walked away quietly, the way he and his mother had once assumed I would. I told him the truth, that there had been moments, especially in the beginning, when giving up would have felt easier than continuing to fight against people who had spent years underestimating me. But I also told him that easier has never meant right, and that the version of myself who might have walked away quietly was not someone I was willing to become, not for him, not for anyone. He did not have a response to that, and we finished our coffee in a silence that felt, for the first time in years, honest rather than tense. Diane and I have not spoken since the day the judge read her letter aloud, though I heard through my son months later that she had moved to a smaller condominium after selling the large family home she once used to entertain guests. Some part of me expected to feel satisfaction hearing that, the kind of sharp, vindictive joy people describe in stories like this one. But instead I mostly just felt tired, the way you feel after finally putting down something heavy you carried too long. I do not wish her harm, but I also do not wish to pretend that her actions did not shape years of unnecessary suffering in my life, suffering she seemed to view at the time as simply the cost of protecting her son. My bookkeeping business grew steadily over the following 2 years, slowly at first, built almost entirely through word of mouth from other small business owners who had heard, in vague terms, about my story. I hired my first employee 18 months after the divorce was finalized, a young single mother named Priya who reminded me, in certain quiet moments, of exactly how I used to feel before I learned to trust my own judgment. Watching her grow more confident in her role, watching her stop apologizing for asking questions, felt like watching a version of my own healing reflected back at me in someone else's life. My son, now 12, rarely talks about the divorce anymore, though occasionally he will mention almost offhandedly how proud he is that I run my own company, that my name is on the door instead of someone else's. My daughter Nai now has started keeping a journal, something she picked up after watching me write in mine during the hardest months of the case, and she once told me she wants to be a lawyer when she grows up. I did not tell her this outright, but part of me hopes that whatever she becomes, she grows up understanding that her voice, her records, her own quiet documentation of truth will always matter more than anyone else's confidence. There is a strange kind of peace that settles into a life once you stop waiting for someone else's permission to be believed, once you stop shrinking yourself to avoid conflict with people who never intended to treat you fairly in the first place. I think about the version of myself who sat frozen on that office floor years ago, holding a hotel receipt, feeling the entire foundation of her life crack open beneath her. I wish I could tell her, somehow, that the crack was not the end of anything, that it was simply the beginning of learning how strong she actually was. I still keep that old metal lockbox, though it sits empty now in the back of a closet, its purpose long since fulfilled, its contents transformed from private fear into public, undeniable truth. Sometimes I open it anyway, not because there is anything left inside, but because it reminds me of everything I was once too afraid to say out loud, and everything I eventually found the courage to prove. The judge's voice reading Diane's own words aloud still echoes in my memory sometimes, not as trauma, but as a strange kind of gift, the moment the truth finally became louder than the lie. Daniel eventually rebuilt a smaller version of his contracting business, working mostly solo now, without the reputation or client base he once took for granted before the case became quiet local knowledge. I have heard through mutual friends that he tells a softened version of the story now, one where the divorce was simply complicated, carefully avoiding any mention of forged intentions or hidden transfers. I no longer feel the need to correct that narrative to anyone who asks because the court record exists, permanent and unshakable, regardless of whatever version of events Daniel prefers to tell at dinner parties now. What I have learned more than anything through the humiliation of that courtroom, through the fear of losing my children, through years of being told I contributed nothing to a life I helped build with my own hands, is this. Confidence is not the same as truth, and the people who laugh loudest before the verdict are often the ones most afraid of what happens once everyone else finally hears the whole story. I walked into that courtroom being mocked, and I walked out with my name finally, fully, undeniably attached to everything I had always deserved. There are still hard days, moments when old fears resurface unexpectedly, triggered by something as small as a smell or a song or a familiar tone of voice from a stranger in a grocery store. But those moments pass more quickly now, replaced by the steady, quiet certainty that I built something real, something mine, out of the wreckage someone else assumed would destroy me completely. And when my children ask me sometimes what happened during the divorce, I tell them simply that their mother learned the hard way that the truth is always worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes to arrive. About 6 months after the ruling, on Rebecca's recommendation, I started taking both children to see a family therapist named Mr. Owens, a soft-spoken man who specialized in helping kids process high-conflict separations. In our early sessions, my son mostly stayed quiet, answering questions with short, careful sentences, as though he were still worried that saying too much might somehow reopen old wounds between his parents. My daughter, younger and more openly emotional, drew pictures during her sessions, family scenes that Mr. Owens gently helped her narrate, revealing fears and confusions she had never fully voiced out loud to me at home. Over time, both children grew more comfortable, more willing to talk about the fear they had carried quietly during those long months of hearings and depositions, fear I had not always realized they were absorbing so deeply. Mr. Owens explained to me, during one of our parent-only sessions, that children often sense conflict long before they understand its details, and that consistency and honesty, even in small daily moments, matter more than any single dramatic gesture of reassurance. I took that lesson seriously, making a point afterward to answer their questions honestly in age-appropriate ways, rather than deflecting the way I once had out of fear of overwhelming them. By the following year, both children seemed noticeably lighter, more willing to talk openly about their father without the careful hesitation that had once colored every mention of him, a shift Mr. Owens described as a healthy sign of emotional stabilization. Daniel, to his credit, began attending a few co-parenting counseling sessions himself, awkward and stilted at first, though gradually more willing to acknowledge in small ways the impact his choices had on our children's sense of security. I do not know if he ever fully understood the depth of what his actions cost all of us, but I noticed slowly a quieter, more consistent presence in his visits, fewer canceled weekends, fewer distracted phone calls during pickup. Looking back now, years removed from that cold courtroom morning, I recognize that healing was never a single moment, not the verdict, not the letter, not even the quiet relief of walking down those courthouse steps with Rebecca beside me. Healing was slower than that, built gradually through therapy sessions, bedtime conversations, ordinary Tuesday evenings spent doing homework at the kitchen table without the weight of legal deadlines pressing down on every decision. It was built through watching my children laugh freely again, through building a business with my own name on the door, through learning, finally, that my worth had never actually depended on anyone else's willingness to see it.